The clock on the hospital wall showed 7:15 p.m. when Jake finally clocked out. His feet hurt, his back ached, and all he wanted was to get home, order some pizza, and watch something mindless on TV. Working as a nurse in the emergency room meant 12-hour shifts that felt like 24, especially on days like today when they had 3 car accidents, 2 heart attacks, and a kid who had somehow managed to get his head stuck in a fence. Jake grabbed his water bottle from his locker and checked his phone. 3 missed calls from his mom, 2 texts from his brother asking about weekend plans, and a notification from his apartment complex about some maintenance work scheduled for next week. He made a mental note to call his mom back once he got home. She worried too much, especially since he moved out on his own last month. The parking garage was mostly empty now. Most of the day shift nurses had left hours ago, and the night crew was already settling in for what would probably be another crazy evening. Jake's black Honda Civic sat in the same spot he'd been parking in for the past 2 years. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was reliable, had good gas mileage, and most importantly, it was paid off. At 26, Jake was proud of the fact that he didn't have a car payment hanging over his head like most of his friends. He tossed his gym bag in the back seat and started the engine. The radio came on automatically, playing some pop song he'd heard a million times but couldn't name. Jake turned it down and pulled out of the garage, grateful that traffic wasn't too heavy. The drive to his new apartment complex usually took about 20 minutes. Depending on the lights, and whether there was construction on Highway 15, moving had been a big decision for Jake. He'd been living with 2 roommates in a cramped 3-bedroom house near the University District, but the constant parties, dirty dishes, and drama had finally worn him down. When his friend Tony mentioned that there was an opening in his apartment complex, Jake jumped at the chance. The rent was a bit higher, but having his own space seemed worth it. The Meadowbrook apartments weren't anything special from the outside. Built in the 1990s, the complex had that generic beige stucco look that seemed popular back then. But the units were decent-sized and the location was perfect. Close enough to the hospital for an easy commute, but far enough away that he wouldn't run into coworkers at the grocery store every weekend. Jake had only lived there for 2 weeks, but he was already starting to feel settled. His apartment was on the 4th floor, Unit 4B, with a nice view of the courtyard and the small pool that he hadn't used yet, but planned to once the weather got warmer. The building had about 60 units, and Jake had met a few of his neighbors in passing. There was Mrs. Chen from down the hall who always smiled and said hello in the elevator, a young couple with a baby stroller who lived near the stairs, and a few college students who seemed harmless enough. As Jake pulled into the complex parking lot, he noticed it was busier than usual. Most residents were probably home from work by now, cooking dinner or getting ready to go out for the evening. He drove slowly through the lot looking for his assigned spot. Parking was one of those things you didn't think about until you moved somewhere new. At his old place, you just parked wherever you could find a spot and hoped your car would still be there in the morning. Here at Meadowbrook, each resident got one assigned parking space, and the management company was pretty strict about it. Jake had already gotten a warning notice on his windshield once when he accidentally parked in spot 47 instead of 48. The notice was polite but firm about making sure residents parked only in their designated areas. Jake found his spot and pulled in carefully. He was still getting used to the tight spaces and didn't want to accidentally ding anyone's car. The last thing he needed was an angry note or worse, having to deal with insurance claims over a parking lot fender bender. As he turned off the engine, Jake glanced around the parking lot. Most of the cars were the usual mix you'd expect in a middle-income apartment complex. A few older sedans, some small SUVs, a couple of pickup trucks, and the occasional newer model that suggested someone either had a really good job or really good credit. Nothing too fancy, but nothing too beat up either. Jake grabbed his bag from the back seat and locked the car. The key fob made that satisfying beep-beep sound that let him know the doors were secure. He'd had the car broken into once when he lived downtown, and ever since then, he was paranoid about making sure everything was locked up tight. The walk to the building entrance was only about 50 feet, but Jake found himself looking around more than usual. Maybe it was just being tired after a long shift, or maybe it was still adjusting to a new place, but something felt a little off. Not dangerous exactly, just different. Like when you're in a hotel and keep trying to put your key card in the wrong door because muscle memory hasn't caught up with your new surroundings yet. Jake noticed a woman, standing at one of the ground floor windows, looking out at the parking lot. She appeared to be middle-aged, with blonde hair and what looked like a bathrobe or house dress. It wasn't unusual for people to look out their windows, especially in the evening when everyone was coming home from work. Jake figured she was probably just waiting for someone or checking to see if a package had been delivered. He walked toward the main entrance, fishing around in his pocket for his key fob. The building had one of those electronic entry systems where you had to scan your fob to get in. Jake was still getting used to it after living in places where you just needed a regular key. Technology was supposed to make things easier, but sometimes he missed the simplicity of just turning a key in a lock. The fob wasn't in his usual pocket, which meant it was probably in his bag somewhere. Jake stopped walking and set his bag down on the concrete, unzipping the main compartment. He could feel the woman in the window still watching him, which was a little odd but not necessarily concerning. Some people were just naturally curious about their neighbors. After a moment of digging around past his stethoscope, lunch container, and change of clothes, Jake found the key fob attached to his car keys. He stood up, shouldered his bag again, and walked the remaining 20 feet to the entrance. The electronic reader beeped and flashed green, and Jake pulled open the heavy glass door. As he stepped into the lobby, Jake could still feel eyes on him. He glanced back through the glass door and saw the same woman, still at her window, still watching. This time their eyes met for just a second before she quickly looked away. Something about her expression seemed more intense than simple curiosity, but Jake shrugged it off. Maybe she was new too and was just trying to figure out who all her neighbors were. The elevator was already on the ground floor, which was a nice surprise. Jake pressed the button for the 4th floor and leaned against the wall as the doors closed. Tomorrow was his day off, which meant he could sleep in, do some laundry, and maybe finally unpack the last few boxes that were still sitting in his bedroom. Moving was exhausting, but slowly this new place was starting to feel like home. Jake barely had time to put his key in the lock of his apartment door when he heard footsteps echoing in the hallway behind him, heavy, deliberate footsteps that seemed to be moving with purpose. He turned around to see the same blonde woman from the window walking quickly toward him, her house slippers making a soft shuffling sound against the carpeted hallway. She was older than he'd initially thought, probably in her early 50s with the kind of carefully styled hair that suggested regular trips to the salon. Her floral bathrobe was tied tightly around her waist, and her face had an expression that Jake couldn't quite read. Concern? Suspicion? Anger? Maybe all three. "Excuse me," she called out when she was still about 10 feet away. Her voice had a sharp edge to it that immediately put Jake on alert. "I need to ask you something." Jake paused with his key halfway into the lock. This wasn't exactly how he'd planned to meet his neighbors. "Sure," he said, trying to keep his voice friendly despite his exhaustion. "What can I help you with?" The woman stopped about 3 feet away from him, close enough that Jake could smell her perfume. Something floral and strong that reminded him of his grandmother. But unlike his grandmother, this woman's eyes were hard and suspicious as they looked him up and down. "I saw you in the parking lot just now," she said, crossing her arms over her chest, "with that black Honda Civic. I've been living in this building for 4 years and I've never seen you before." Jake blinked, genuinely confused by the direction this conversation was taking. "Oh, well, I just moved in a couple weeks ago. Unit 4B, he gestured toward his door. "I'm Jake, by the way." But the woman didn't seem interested in introductions. Instead, she took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "That's interesting because I know every car that belongs in this parking lot, and I've never seen that Honda before tonight." "It's my car," Jake said slowly, wondering if maybe this woman had some kind of memory problem, or if she was confused about which building she lived in. "I've been parking it in space 48 for the past 2 weeks. The woman shook her head firmly. "No, that's not right. The person who had that apartment before moved out over a month ago, and there haven't been any new tenants since then. I would know because I keep track of these things." Jake was starting to feel like he'd wandered into some kind of alternate reality. "I can show you my lease if you want," he offered, reaching for his wallet. "Or my key fob. I just used it to get into the building." "Anyone can get one of those," the woman said dismissively. "They're not that secure. I've been telling the management company for years that they need better security measures." This was getting weird fast. Jake glanced down the hallway, hoping maybe one of his other neighbors would appear and vouch for him, but the corridor was empty. "Look, I think there might be some confusion here. I definitely live in 4B. I've got mail being delivered here, utilities in my name, the whole thing. The woman's expression grew even more suspicious. "What's your last name?" "Henderson," Jake replied automatically, then immediately regretted giving out personal information to someone who was acting so strangely. "I don't believe you," she said flatly. "And I want to know what you were really doing with that car." Jake felt his patience starting to wear thin. He'd been on his feet for 12 hours, dealt with difficult patients and stressed families all day, and now he was being interrogated by a neighbor who seemed to think he was some kind of criminal. "I was driving my car to my apartment after work," he said, trying to keep his voice level. "Same thing I do every day." "Where do you work?" the woman demanded. "At Memorial Hospital." "I'm a nurse in the emergency room," the woman snorted. "Right, and I'm the Queen of England." Jake stared at her in disbelief. "Why would I lie about being a nurse?" "Because you're obviously not telling the truth about anything else," she shot back. "I saw you digging around in that bag in the parking lot. What were you looking for? Tools to break into the car?" "I was looking for my key fob," Jake explained, his voice getting a little sharper despite his efforts to stay calm. "The same key fob I used to get into this building. The same building where I live." But the woman was already shaking her head again. "I don't think so. I think you found that car unlocked and figured you'd take it for a joyride. Probably thought nobody would notice if you parked it here for a while." Jake couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Ma'am, I have the registration in my glove compartment, insurance cards, the title. Everything has my name on it." "Those could be fake," she said quickly. "Or stolen. You look like the type who would know how to get fake documents." That comment hit Jake like a slap in the face. He looked like the type. What exactly did that mean? Jake had always prided himself on being professional, well-groomed, and approachable. He wore scrubs to work and business casual clothes when he went out. He kept his hair neat and his beard trimmed. What exactly about his appearance suggested he was a criminal? "Look," Jake said, his voice getting colder. "I don't know what your problem is, but I'm not dealing with this anymore. I've had a long day, and I just want to go into my apartment and relax." He turned back toward his door, but the woman stepped closer, her voice getting louder. "Don't you dare turn your back on me," she snapped. "I'm not done talking to you." Jake spun around, his exhaustion finally giving way to anger. "Actually, you are done talking to me. I don't owe you any explanations about my car, my apartment, or my life. I've been polite. I've answered your questions, and I've tried to clear up whatever confusion you have. But I'm not standing here getting accused of stealing my own car." The woman's face flushed red. "I knew it. I could tell from the moment I saw you that you were trouble. You're getting aggressive now because I caught you." "I'm getting frustrated because you won't listen to reason," Jake replied. "I showed you my key fob. I told you my apartment number. I offered to show you documentation. What more do you want?" "I want you to admit what you were really doing with that car," she said, her voice rising to a level that would definitely carry to the neighboring apartments. "And I want to know how you got access to this building." Jake realized that no amount of explanation was going to satisfy this woman. She had decided he was guilty of something, and nothing he said was going to change her mind. "You know what? Call the police if you're so concerned. Have them run my license plate. Check my ID against the lease. Do whatever you need to do to convince yourself that I belong here." As soon as the words left his mouth, Jake realized he probably shouldn't have suggested involving the police. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because situations like this had a way of escalating beyond anyone's control. But it was too late to take it back. The woman's eyes lit up like he'd just given her permission to do exactly what she'd been wanting to do all along. "Maybe I will," she said, pulling her phone out of her bathrobe pocket. Maybe that's exactly what needs to happen here. Jake watched in growing disbelief as the woman started scrolling through her phone. "Are you seriously going to call 911 because your neighbor came home from work?" "You're not my neighbor," she said without looking up from her screen. "And I don't know what you were doing with that car, but I'm going to find out." Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he realized this woman was actually going to follow through with her threat. This whole situation was about to get much more serious, and there wasn't anything he could do to stop it. Jake watched in disbelief as the woman pressed 3 numbers on her phone screen. The little electronic beeps seemed to echo in the hallway, each one making the situation feel more surreal. She held the phone up to her ear and waited, tapping her foot impatiently while Jake stood frozen by his apartment door. "1, what's your emergency?" Jake could hear the dispatcher's voice faintly through the phone. The woman's entire demeanor changed instantly. Gone was the confrontational neighbor from 30 seconds ago, replaced by someone who sounded genuinely frightened and in distress. Yes. "Hello, I need police at the Meadowbrook Apartments on Pine Street," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "There's a suspicious man here who I believe has stolen a car." Jake felt his stomach drop. This was really happening. A neighbor was actually calling the police on him for parking his own car and walking to his own apartment. "Ma'am, can you describe what you observed?" the dispatcher asked. "I saw him in our parking lot digging through a bag next to a black Honda Civic. When I confronted him about it, he became very aggressive and hostile. He claims the car belongs to him, but I've lived here for 4 years and I've never seen him before. I think he's trying to steal the vehicle." Jake couldn't stay quiet anymore. "That's not what happened," he called out loud enough for the dispatcher to hear. "I live here. That's my car." The woman shot him a furious look and moved further down the hallway, lowering her voice. But Jake could still hear most of what she was saying. "The suspect is still here and he's getting more agitated. He's a black male, probably mid-20s, about 6 feet tall, wearing dark scrubs. He claims to live in the building, but I know that's not true." Jake felt like the walls were closing in around him. Every word out of this woman's mouth was making him sound more and more like a criminal. She was taking everything he'd said and twisting it to fit her narrative. He pulled out his own phone and opened the camera app. If this situation was going to escalate, he needed to have his own record of what was actually happening. Jake held the phone up and started recording, making sure to capture both himself and the woman on the call. "I'm recording this," he announced clearly, both for the woman's benefit and so it would be captured on his video. "I want there to be a clear record of what's actually happening here." The woman noticed him filming and her voice immediately got louder and more panicked. "Now he's recording me," she told the dispatcher. "He's trying to intimidate me. I feel very threatened right now." "Ma'am, are you in a safe location?" the dispatcher asked. "I'm in the hallway of my apartment building. The suspect is about 10 feet away from me, and he's recording everything I'm saying." This feels very threatening. Jake couldn't believe how completely she was misrepresenting the situation. "I'm recording for my own protection," he said loudly enough for the dispatcher to hear. "This woman confronted me when I came home from work and is now making false accusations to the police." "Sir, please stay calm," he heard the dispatcher say, apparently addressing him now. "Officers are on their way to your location." The woman continued her dramatic performance. "He's been acting erratically this whole time. First, I caught him going through his bag next to the car. Then he got angry when I asked him about it. He told me to call the police myself, which makes me think he's done this before." That wasn't even close to what had happened. But Jake realized that trying to argue with her while she was on the phone with 911 was only going to make things worse. Instead, he focused on his recording, making sure to speak clearly and calmly for the camera. "My name is Jake Henderson," he said to his phone. "I live in apartment 4B at the Meadowbrook Apartments. I just got home from my job at Memorial Hospital where I work as a registered nurse. I parked my car in my assigned parking space and used my key fob to enter the building. This woman approached me in the hallway and began accusing me of stealing my own vehicle." The woman was getting more animated as she continued her call. "He's making up stories now, trying to sound legitimate. But I know he doesn't live here. The apartment he claims to live in has been empty for over a month." Jake realized he needed to prove his residency immediately. Still recording with one hand, he used his other hand to unlock his apartment door. The electronic lock beeped and clicked open. "As you can see," he said to his phone, "I have a key that opens apartment 4B because I live here." But the woman wasn't paying attention to his demonstration. She was too busy painting him as increasingly dangerous to the 911 dispatcher. "I think he might be on drugs," she said, her voice full of concern. "His behavior is very unpredictable. One minute he's trying to act normal, the next minute he's getting aggressive and making threats." "I haven't made any threats," Jake said, trying to keep his voice level. "I've been standing here trying to explain that this is all a misunderstanding." The woman spun around to face him. "Stop talking," she shouted. "You're making me feel unsafe." "Ma'am, officers should be there within the next few minutes," the dispatcher said. "Please stay on the line with me until they arrive." Jake could hear sirens in the distance now. The sound made his heart rate spike even though he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. He'd never been in trouble with the police before, never even gotten a speeding ticket. The idea of patrol cars showing up at his apartment building because of him felt surreal. Other residents were starting to notice the commotion. Jake saw Mrs. Chen peek out of her apartment door down the hall. then quickly close it again when she saw what was happening. A few other doors had opened slightly, with curious neighbors trying to figure out what all the shouting was about. The woman noticed the audience and seemed to play up her distress even more. "There are other residents here now," she told the dispatcher. "Everyone is getting scared because of how this man is acting." Jake looked around at the partially opened doors and felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. These people were his new neighbors, and their first real impression of him was going to be seeing him surrounded by police cars. Even if everything got sorted out, they'd always remember him as the guy who had the cops called on him. The sirens were getting louder now. Jake estimated they had maybe 2 or 3 minutes before the officers arrived. He needed to think about how to handle the situation in a way that wouldn't make things worse. "I'm going to put my phone away now," he said clearly, both to the woman and to his recording. "I'm going to put my hands where the officers can see them when they get here. And I'm going to cooperate fully with their investigation." He ended the recording and slipped his phone into his pocket, then raised his hand slightly and took a step back from his apartment door. The woman was still on the phone, now describing how he was positioning himself and how she was concerned about what he might be planning. Jake closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. In just a few minutes, his quiet evening at home had turned into a situation where police officers were rushing to his apartment building because a neighbor thought he was a car thief. All he'd wanted to do was order a pizza and watch TV. The sirens were very close now. Jake could see red and blue lights reflecting off the walls of the hallway, coming through the windows at either end of the corridor. This was really happening, and there was nothing he could do now except wait for the officers to arrive and hope that the truth would be enough to clear everything up. The woman finally ended her call with the dispatcher, but she kept her phone in her hand, ready to use it again if needed. She looked at Jake with a mixture of satisfaction and wariness, like someone who had just caught a burglar but wasn't sure if he might try to run. "The police will sort this out," she said, as if she were doing him some kind of favor. Jake didn't respond. There wasn't anything left to say until the officers got there. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and 2 uniformed police officers stepped into the 4th-floor hallway. Jake's heart was pounding as he watched them approach, their faces serious and alert as they took in the scene. Officer Rodriguez, a woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, was the first to speak. "We got a report about a possible vehicle theft," she said, looking between Jake and the woman in the bathrobe. "Can someone tell us what's going on here?" The woman immediately stepped forward, her phone still clutched in her hand like a weapon. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. I'm Linda Patterson from apartment 1C. I witnessed this man acting suspiciously around a black Honda Civic in our parking lot, and when I questioned him about it, he became aggressive and hostile." Officer Rodriguez's partner, a tall man with graying temples whose nameplate read Wilson, pulled out a small notepad. "Ma'am, can you be more specific about what you observed?" Linda launched into her version of events, gesturing dramatically as she spoke. "I was looking out my window around 7:30 when I saw him rummaging through a bag next to the Honda. It was very suspicious behavior, like he was looking for tools or something to break into the car. When I came up here to confront him about it, he claimed the car belonged to him, but I've lived in this building for 4 years and I know he doesn't live here." Jake waited for her to finish, then spoke up. "Officers, my name is Jake Henderson. I live in apartment 4B right here." He gestured toward his door. "I was coming home from work at Memorial Hospital when this lady approached me and started accusing me of stealing my own car." Officer Rodriguez looked at Jake with the kind of neutral expression that police officers probably learned in training. Not hostile, but not friendly either. "Sir, do you have identification with you?" "Yes, ma'am." Jake slowly reached for his wallet, making sure to move deliberately so neither officer would think he was reaching for anything threatening. He handed over his driver's license. Officer Wilson stepped closer to examine the license. "This address matches apartment 4B, he said to his partner. Linda shook her head vigorously. "That could be fake or old. I'm telling you, that apartment has been empty for over a month. I walk by it every day." "Ma'am, when did you last see someone going in or out of 4B? Officer Rodriguez asked. Linda paused, apparently thinking. "Well, I don't watch the hallway 24 hours a day, but I would have noticed if someone new moved in. There would have been moving trucks, people carrying boxes, that sort of thing." Jake realized this was his opportunity to set the record straight. Officers, I can prove I live here. I have my key fob, my apartment key, mail with this address, and my lease agreement inside my apartment. Let's see the key fob first, Officer Wilson said. Jake pulled out his keys and showed them the electronic fob. Officer Rodriguez examined it closely. These are building specific, she noted. You can't just buy these anywhere. He could have found it, Linda interjected, or stolen it from the real resident. Officer Wilson looked skeptical. Ma'am, that seems pretty unlikely. Let's see if the key actually works. Jake stepped up to his apartment door and pressed the fob against the electronic reader. The device beeped once and flashed green. Then Jake turned the handle and opened the door. Would you like to see my lease agreement? It's on my kitchen counter. Both officers exchanged a look that suggested they were starting to understand what kind of situation they were dealing with. That won't be necessary right now, Officer Rodriguez said. But we do need to verify the vehicle registration. Can you show us to your car? The group made their way down to the parking lot, Linda trailing behind them, still muttering about how something wasn't right. Jake led them to parking space 48, where his black Honda Civic sat exactly where he'd left it. This is my car, Jake said, pulling out his car keys. I can show you the registration and insurance cards. Officer Wilson walked around the vehicle, checking the license plate number against something on his notepad.
Can you pop the hood for us?
Jake did as requested, and Officer Wilson shined his flashlight on the VIN number visible on the engine block. He compared it to Jake's registration, then entered some information into a small device that looked like a handheld computer. Everything checks out, he announced after a few minutes. The vehicle is registered to Jake Henderson at this address. No reports of it being stolen or involved in any criminal activity. Linda looked stunned. But that can't be right. I know he doesn't live here. Officer Rodriguez turned to face Linda with a patient but firm expression. Ma'am, we've verified that Mr. Henderson lives in apartment 4B and that this vehicle belongs to him. Is there some other specific reason you believed he was committing a crime? The question hung in the air for a moment. Jake could see Linda struggling to come up with an answer that didn't reveal the real reason for her suspicions. Well, I mean, you can never be too careful these days, she finally said. There's been a lot of crime in this area lately. Officer Wilson looked up from his notepad. Ma'am, I've worked this beat for 8 years, and crime rates in this neighborhood have actually been declining. Can you tell us about any specific incidents that made you concerned? Linda's face flushed red. I don't have to justify wanting to keep my community safe. Jake finally spoke up. Officers, I think what happened here is that this lady saw me come home from work, made some assumptions based on my appearance, and decided I must be up to no good. I was looking for my key fob in my bag, which she interpreted as suspicious behavior. When I tried to explain that I lived here, she refused to believe me and called 911. Officer Rodriguez nodded slowly. Mr. Henderson, would you be willing to show us some mail or other documentation with your address just so we can close this out completely? Absolutely. Jake led them back upstairs to his apartment where he showed them several pieces of mail, his lease agreement, and even his utility bills. Everything confirmed that he was exactly who he said he was and lived, exactly where he claimed to live. Linda stood in the hallway looking increasingly uncomfortable as the evidence mounted against her version of events. When Officer Wilson asked her directly if she had any other concerns about Jake's presence in the building, she finally shook her head. I guess I was mistaken, she mumbled. Officer Rodriguez closed her notepad and looked at both of them seriously. Ma'am, I want you to understand that filing false police reports is a crime. We take these calls seriously, and they tie up resources that might be needed for real emergencies. I didn't file a false report, Linda protested. I really thought something suspicious was happening. But you also refused to consider any evidence that contradicted your assumptions, Officer Wilson added. Mr. Henderson showed you his key fob, told you his apartment number, and offered to show you documentation. Instead of accepting that you might be mistaken, you escalated the situation. Jake felt a mixture of relief and frustration as he watched the officers wrap up their investigation. He was glad the truth had come out, but he was also angry that he'd had to go through this ordeal in the first place. Officers, I want to be clear that I don't have any hard feelings toward the police department, Jake said. You did your job professionally, and I appreciate that you took the time to verify everything thoroughly. Officer Rodriguez smiled for the first time since arriving. "We appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Henderson, and welcome to the neighborhood." As the officers prepared to leave, Officer Wilson turned back to Linda. "Ma'am, I'd encourage you to get to know your neighbors a little better before assuming the worst about them. Community safety is important, but so is community trust." Linda nodded weakly and shuffled back toward the elevator without making eye contact with anyone. Jake watched her go, wondering if this experience would change how she viewed her neighbors, or if she'd just be more careful about getting caught the next time. The officers left a few minutes later, and Jake finally found himself alone in his apartment hallway. Several neighbors had witnessed the whole thing, and he could see curious faces peering out from behind partially open doors. He waved awkwardly and went inside his apartment, closing the door behind him. Jake sat down heavily on his couch and looked around his living room. Moving boxes were still stacked against one wall, and he hadn't hung any pictures yet. The place still felt temporary, like a hotel room rather than a home. After tonight's events, he wondered if it would ever feel like home. Jake woke up the next morning feeling like he'd lived through a strange dream. For a few blissful seconds, he forgot about the events of the previous evening. Then reality came flooding back as he remembered Linda's accusations, the police visit, and the humiliation of having to prove he belonged in his own home. His phone was buzzing with notifications. Jake had posted the video he recorded to his social media accounts the night before, along with a caption explaining what had happened. He'd been too worked up to sleep anyway, so he figured he might as well document the incident while it was fresh in his memory. The response was overwhelming. The video had been shared hundreds of times overnight, with comments ranging from outrage to support, to people sharing their own similar experiences. Jake's phone kept buzzing with notifications as more and more people viewed and shared the footage. There was a knock at his door around 10 in the morning. Jake looked through the peephole and saw a man in a business suit holding a clipboard. When he opened the door, the man introduced himself as David Chen, the property manager for Meadowbrook Apartments. "Mr. Henderson, I want to start by apologizing for what happened last night," David said. "I've reviewed the police report and spoken with the officers involved. What Mrs. Patterson did was completely unacceptable." Jake invited him in and they sat in the living room, surrounded by the moving boxes Jake still hadn't unpacked. David explained that Linda had a history of complaints about other residents, most of which had been dismissed as neighborhood disputes or misunderstandings. "She's called the office probably 20 times in the past year," David said, shaking his head, "complaining about noise, parking violations, people she claimed didn't belong in the building. We thought she was just being overly vigilant about security." "Has she done this to other residents?" Jake asked. David hesitated before answering. "There have been incidents. A few months ago, she called the police on a food delivery driver claiming he was trying to break into the building. Last year, she reported a maintenance worker as suspicious because she'd never seen him before, even though he was wearing a company uniform and had proper identification." Jake felt a chill as he realized he probably wasn't Linda's first target. "What are you going to do about it?" "We're going to have a conversation with Mrs. Patterson about appropriate behavior toward other residents," David said. "And I wanted to personally invite you to stay. I know this experience might make you want to look for housing elsewhere, but you seem like exactly the kind of resident we want in this community." Jake appreciated the gesture, but he wasn't sure if staying was the right choice. The thought of running into Linda in the hallway or parking lot made him uncomfortable. What if she decided to target him again? His phone rang while David was still there. It was his supervisor at the hospital, calling to check on him after seeing the video online. "Jake, are you okay?" Nancy asked. "I saw what happened on your social media. Do you need to take a personal day?" "I'm fine," Jake said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. It was just a misunderstanding with a neighbor. "That looked like more than a misunderstanding," Nancy replied. "Listen, if you need to talk to someone about this, the hospital has counseling resources available. What happened to you was wrong, and you shouldn't have to just brush it off." After David left and Jake finished his call with Nancy, he decided to go for a walk around the neighborhood to clear his head. As he was leaving the building, he ran into Mrs. Chen from down the hall, the elderly woman who had always been friendly to him. "Jake, dear, I heard about what happened last night," she said, looking genuinely concerned. "I am so sorry that woman treated you that way." They talked for a few minutes, and Mrs. Chen mentioned that several other residents had reached out to her, expressing support for Jake and embarrassment about Linda's behavior. "She doesn't represent this community," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "Most of us are good people who just want to live peacefully with our neighbors." Over the next few days, Jake's video continued to spread online. Local news stations picked up the story, and Jake found himself giving interviews about racial profiling and the dangers of making assumptions about people based on their appearance. The attention was overwhelming and sometimes uncomfortable, but Jake tried to use it as an opportunity to have important conversations about bias and community safety. He spoke at a neighborhood watch meeting about the difference between being vigilant and being prejudiced. Linda, meanwhile, seemed to disappear. Jake didn't see her around the building for several days, and when he finally did encounter her in the parking lot, she quickly looked away and hurried inside. David later mentioned that she'd been considering breaking her lease early. About 2 weeks after the incident, Jake came home from work to find a handwritten note slipped under his door. It was from Tony, his friend who lived in the building and had recommended the apartment to him in the first place. "Hey man, I heard about what happened with that crazy lady," the note read. "I'm really sorry you had to go through that. A bunch of us neighbors want to throw you a proper welcome party this weekend to show you what this community is really about. Let me know if you're up for it." Jake smiled as he read the note. Maybe this place could feel like home after all. The welcome party was held in the building's community room that Saturday evening. About 30 residents showed up, bringing food and drinks and genuine apologies for Linda's behavior. Jake met families with kids, college students, retirees, and working professionals from all different backgrounds. "We're really glad you decided to stay," said Tom, a teacher who lived on the second floor. "What happened to you could have happened to any of us, and we want to make sure it never happens again." The residents had organized themselves into an informal committee to address issues of bias and discrimination in their community. They planned to work with the management company to develop better policies for handling complaints and to provide training about unconscious bias. Jake was touched by the outpouring of support, but he was also realistic about the challenges that remained. He knew that Linda's attitudes weren't unique, and that similar incidents could happen again, either to him or to other residents. During his speech at the welcome party, Jake tried to strike a balance between gratitude and honesty. "I want to thank everyone for making me feel welcome," he said. "But I also want us all to remember that this kind of thing happens more often than we'd like to admit. What made my situation unique was that I had the resources to document it and the platform to share it. Not everyone who experiences discrimination has those advantages." The party was a success, and Jake finally started to feel like he belonged in the building. He unpacked his remaining boxes that weekend and hung pictures on the walls. For the first time since moving in, his apartment felt like home. Linda did break her lease a month later, moving out without ceremony one weekend while most residents were away. Jake never saw her again, though he sometimes wondered if she'd learned anything from their encounter. The incident had changed Jake in ways he was still processing. He'd always known that racial bias existed, but experiencing it so directly and dramatically had been jarring. At the same time, the support he'd received from his neighbors and coworkers had restored his faith in people's capacity for growth and understanding. 6 months later, Jake was elected to the building's resident council, where he worked on policies to ensure that all residents felt safe and welcome. He kept the video of his encounter with Linda on his social media accounts as a reminder of how quickly misunderstandings can escalate and how important it is to approach our neighbors with curiosity rather than suspicion. The Meadowbrook Apartments became a model for other housing communities dealing with similar issues. Jake was proud to be part of that change, even though he'd never asked to be thrust into that role. Sometimes late at night, when Jake was coming home from a long shift at the hospital, he'd remember that first evening when Linda confronted him in the hallway. The memory still stung, but it no longer filled him with anger or fear. Instead, it reminded him of how much power each of us has to either build up or tear down our communities, one interaction at a time. Jake had chosen to build up, and his neighbors had chosen to join him. In the end, that made all the difference.